Your whole life, you've been carrying around facts that aren't actually facts, not half-truths, not outdated research, ideas that were debunked completely and just never got the memo to you. Picture it. You're 10 years old. A teacher slides a quiz across your desk. You fill it out, and she circles back with a verdict. You are a visual learner, maybe auditory, maybe kinesthetic. And from that moment on, you start building a whole story about how your brain works. You tell teachers, you tell employers, you tell yourself. Here's what no one told you. Researchers ran hundreds of controlled classroom studies on this exact idea. They matched instruction to students' supposed learning styles. They mismatched it on purpose. They tracked everything. The results, either way, identical. Zero improvement, zero difference. The concept was invented in 1992 by Neil Fleming, a curriculum consultant, not a neuroscientist. It was never based on brain research. It was an idea someone had, packaged as a quiz, and handed to millions of children before anyone thought to check if it was true. You were never a learning type. You were just a student. In the early 1990s, parents started buying classical music CDs specifically to raise their babies' IQ. Some held speakers against their pregnant stomachs for hours. Schools piped Mozart through classrooms during quiet study time. Baby Einstein became a $100 million empire. Parents genuinely believed they were giving their children a head start, and the science said so. Except the science said nothing of the sort. The original 1993 study didn't test babies. It tested 36 college students on one spatial reasoning task. People who listened to 10 minutes of Mozart beforehand scored slightly better. For 15 minutes. That's it. 36 adults, one task, 15 minutes, and somehow that became the intellectual justification for an entire infant education industry. Every follow-up that looked for lasting IQ gains in children found nothing. Not a small trend, not a reduced version of the effect. Nothing. The original researcher, Frances Rauscher, said publicly that she never claimed the finding applied to infants and never intended that interpretation. Someone else made that leap. The media ran with it. And the baby product industry made hundreds of millions off a misread study note. The Baby Einstein Company was eventually pressured into offering partial refunds for overstating the benefits. If classical music reliably made children smarter, every music teacher alive would be the most intelligent person in any room. None of them are. You go to order coffee and accidentally ask for a beer. Someone immediately smirks and says, "Interesting," because apparently your brain just confessed a secret desire. Freud called these moments parapraxes, brief ruptures, where your unconscious breaks through and exposes something you were hiding. For over a century, that framing stuck. Modern brain imaging disagrees entirely. Verbal slips don't originate in your emotional or motivational centers. They happen in your motor speech regions, the parts of your brain physically assembling sounds in real time. Your brain plans several words ahead while you're still talking, and sounds from upcoming words occasionally bleed backward. It's a scheduling error, not a confession. An assembly line misrouting a part, not a Freudian window into your soul. Freud needed evidence for the unconscious, so he cataloged speech accidents and declared them proof of buried drives. That's not science, that's building a case after you've already decided the verdict. Asking for the chicken when you meant the fish doesn't mean anything alarming. You were just tired, and your brain briefly lost its place. Here's how it's taught. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo randomly split volunteers into guards and prisoners inside a fake jail. Within days, the guards turned brutal on their own. The experiment had to be stopped. Conclusion? Put an ordinary person in a position of institutional power, and the institution wins. Situations override character. People become the role. That conclusion was staged. Audio recordings and post-experiment interviews revealed that Zimbardo, who was simultaneously the lead researcher and the fake prison's superintendent, gave guards explicit instructions on psychological pressure before the study even started. Guards who stayed calm and refused to intimidate prisoners were sidelined. Their shifts were cut. One guard admitted years later he'd been consciously performing a character he believed Zimbardo wanted, not acting on genuine personal impulse. A study where the researcher tells guards to be harsh, removes guards who aren't harsh enough, and then concludes that guards naturally become harsh isn't a scientific finding. It's a script with footnotes. Independent researchers who later replicated the conditions without coaching found substantially weaker effects. The famous result isn't a discovery about human nature. It's a discovery about what happens when someone runs a study and also directs it. 65% of ordinary people will deliver what they believe to be a lethal electric shock to a stranger if an authority figure tells them to. You've probably heard this. It's been cited in 1,000 articles about obedience, conformity, and the banality of evil. Here's what you haven't been told. That number came from one version of the experiment. There were 24. The famous 65% came from a single version specifically engineered to stack every pressure factor at once. The authority figure, standing directly behind the participant, no other voices in the room, and a painfully slow escalation designed so each step felt like a minor continuation of the last. Remove any one of those factors, and the number collapsed. When the authority figure left the room and gave instructions by phone, compliance fell to 20%. When two other participants, planted actors, refused to continue, real subjects followed them and stopped almost immediately. What Milgram actually proved is narrower and more useful than the headline suggests. Obedience isn't a fixed human trait. It's the product of very specific conditions: isolation, physical authority, slow escalation. Remove any one compliance breaks. That's not a verdict on human nature. That's an instruction manual for recognizing the conditions that make people stop thinking for themselves. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You know these. Most people do. And somewhere along the way, the idea took hold that grief moves through these stages in sequence, that healing follows a path, and acceptance is waiting at the end of it. Here's the thing. Kubler-Ross didn't study people who were grieving a loss. She interviewed terminally ill patients processing their own approaching deaths. Grief researchers who later studied actual bereavement found no consistent staging whatsoever. People skip stages, revisit them. Some never reach anything recognizable as acceptance and still recover completely. There's no evidence that failing to reach acceptance makes long-term outcomes worse. The real damage is this. People in genuine grief are being quietly told they're doing it wrong, that they're behind schedule, that their feelings are out of order. Kubler-Ross herself said later that the stages were never meant to be a fixed, linear sequence. They were a rough observation. Someone else turned a rough observation into a mandatory itinerary. Grief doesn't have stages, it has weather. For roughly 20 years, beginning in the early 1980s, a significant portion of therapists operated on a shared assumption. Traumatic memories can be completely sealed off in the unconscious and recovered years later through the right techniques. Hypnosis, guided imagery, dream interpretation. Memory doesn't work that way. It's not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you're rebuilding it from fragments. And that rebuilding process is vulnerable to suggestion at every step. Elizabeth Loftus proved this with controlled experiments. Using nothing more than carefully framed questions during guided interviews, she implanted entirely false childhood memories in volunteer participants. Being lost in a shopping mall, witnessing an accident, events that never happened became vivid recollections the subjects would defend confidently. The consequences weren't academic. Families were destroyed. People were imprisoned for abuse investigators later concluded had never occurred. Courts eventually stopped accepting recovered memory testimony once the science was examined. The therapy designed to uncover buried trauma had been manufacturing new trauma from scratch. In 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her Queens apartment. A New York Times article claimed that 38 neighbors watched from their windows and not one called for help. Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané built one of social psychology's most cited findings on that premise. When more people witness an emergency, each individual feels less responsible. Diffusion of responsibility. The bystander effect. There's a problem. The story wasn't accurate. Investigators who later reviewed the police records and located surviving witnesses found that most neighbors heard something but had no clear view of what was happening. At least one person called the police. A neighbor came outside and held Genovese as she died. The Times reporter inflated both the witness count and the degree of inaction to sharpen the story. The bystander effect is real, but it's significantly smaller than textbooks suggest. In unambiguous emergencies, when people clearly understand someone is in danger, most don't simply stand by. The myth that they do has made people feel absolved of responsibility they actually have. You're an INTJ, or an ENFP, or one of 14 other combinations. Millions of people use these labels as maps of who they are. Organizations spend serious money on Myers-Briggs assessments to hire people, build teams, and make career decisions. Here's the core problem. Roughly 50% of people who retake the test after just 5 weeks get a completely different result. A test where half the answers change in a month isn't measuring a stable personality trait. It's measuring your mood on the day you took it. The assessment was built during World War II by Catherine Cook Briggs and her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers, neither of whom had formal training in psychology. They based it on Carl Jung's theoretical personality archetypes, which weren't themselves empirically derived. The whole structure is intuition, built on theory, built on more intuition, wrapped in a professional-looking framework and sold to HR departments worldwide. A horoscope with better graphic design and a corporate licensing fee is still a horoscope. Logical? Left-brained. Creative? Right-brained. You've used this. Everyone has. It feels like it maps onto something real. In 2013, researchers examined more than 1,000 brain scans and found zero evidence that individuals consistently show higher activity in one hemisphere. Creative tasks engage both hemispheres simultaneously. So do analytical ones. The brain doesn't divide labor down the middle. This myth traces back to real, legitimate science, Roger Sperry's Nobel Prize-winning research on patients whose corpus callosum had been surgically cut to treat severe epilepsy. Those patients did show some functional differences between hemispheres. That's a real finding about people with severed brain tissue. Someone took that finding, removed the surgical context entirely, and built a personality sorting system for neurologically normal people out of it. Saying you're a right-brained creative because of Sperry's research is like saying you can only walk on your left leg because someone else's right one was injured. 10 myths, all of them taught in schools, repeated in offices, printed in textbooks, and handed to you like facts. The most dangerous ideas aren't the ones that sound outrageous. They're the ones that feel just true enough that no one ever thinks to question them.